Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries, with host and founder Richard Case and co-host and retreat leader Denny Weinberg. Jesus told us to watch for the signs of his return. Today we'll examine what's happening in our world and how it points to the end and his soon return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is End Times Friday, and Denny and I, co-host of this session every Friday, are continuing our discussion from last week, where we gave a brief update on the Iran war, and there's interesting stuff going on. It's kind of a unsettled place where they're trying to see what's going to happen. And while that's going on, Israel is saying, well, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. We don't have to do anything new, and we don't have to attack anybody. If they attack us, we're going to attack them back, but we're going to watch and try to keep what they try to do is knowing that they have an enemy completely surrounding them that doesn't like them. And wants to eliminate them. They just say, if I can just hold them back, I can at least internally, I can have peace. And that's what they would like, And when I had met Netanyahu, I had lunch with him this is in 1998. And he had talked about that, we're a democracy just like you. And he said, what we would like is just to be left alone and to build our economy and actually trade with our neighbors and travel with our neighbors and have them come and see us and be at peace where we can focus on our incredible ingenuity, which they have, and God's given them a tremendous creativity and resources to where literally think about it. They've got the best military in the world. They have incredible healthcare technology. They have all this stuff. They have desalination. They just have it in spades. And that's what they would like to do. And they said, well, at the time they said, you don't even know what it means to have somebody attack you. Of course, 2 years later, it happens 9/11, and we did. But it's interesting what their goal is. And then we talked, about these factions that instead of a two-party system, the parties themselves are splitting into factions. The independents are adding their own faction. And first of all, why don't you talk, because you made a great statement about the impact of that, and then we can talk about why is that such a unique thing for us. It's interesting enough, because of how we built our system, whenever there's factions, it actually makes it almost unworkable. So yeah, I know you had some great thoughts about that.
Well, so the two-party system works well in a government where you need a 50% or better majority to pass something. And in the House, it works that way. In the Senate, as you know, for anything other than financial reconciliation, you need 60 votes. So you need a clear-cut majority. And that's hard to do, but historically with one
party... Stop right there a minute, yeah. Denny, because some people don't understand that in the Senate. And by the way, for a bill to pass, it can be started in the Senate and go to the House and then back to the Senate, or it can start in the House and go to the Senate. But the Senate, so when we talk about in the election, and we just had one in 2024, well, the Republicans have majority in the Senate and the House and the presidency. So you would think, well, they can just get done what they want to get done. Interesting enough, they can't, because that majority is just slightly over 50%, and it's not 60% in the Senate. So explain that a little bit deeper so people get a clarity, because it's very confusing to people is, what do you mean 60%? I thought all we have to do is have a majority vote, and that's not so. Maybe you could explain a little bit that, because that's kind of an important point.
And I think our founders they did this because when they thought about this Congress, that the Senate is made up of two people chosen from each state. So they don't represent a group of people within the state. They represent the whole state. When we go and we vote for congressional elections, we have somebody that represents our local area. Mm-hmm. There's 435 of them spread across the population in pro rata terms. So we have somebody that represents us, our local vote. That's the House of Representatives. The founders thought, well, since you're already represented, a 50% majority should represent 50% of the people. On the Senate, whether you're a state of 40 million people or a state of 2 million people, you get two statewide representatives to represent your state. So the Senate says, to make sure this really is a majority, we're going to set a 60% threshold, because these people don't come, representing their local, cow patch. They're representing an entire state. And it was a higher standard. And it's been that way from the beginning. So for any bill to be passed in the Senate, it requires 60 61 or 60, I guess it's 60 more, it's probably 60 or more votes in favor of that bill. And there is an exception, and that's related to the annual budget related items where there's not a policy change occurring, there's just funding. And so the Senate can pass a funding bill with a 50% majority. So what that means is if you're depending just on the party, your political party, to carry the water, you have to have 60 members of the Senate. And there's always somebody that's got a slightly different view that might not vote with your party. We can tolerate one or two. That means you need 62 or 63 in the Senate if you're going to count on your party carrying a bill. And the reason that bills are passed in the Senate all the time is because people vote the way they believe they ought to vote, not always with their own party. So Democrats cross over for a Republican-sponsored bill. Republicans cross over for a Democrat-sponsored bill. But increasingly, that's not tolerated by the parties anymore because there's so much angst and anger from one party to another, especially in the current, in the last 3 administrations, but in the current administration, it's just frothing over. So crossing party lines is betrayal. It's considered not good politics. It's just considered, unacceptable. And so it's going to be very tough if we start seeing not just a independent here and there, but in reality, whole big factions that carry 20% of a party or 20% of the American people. We'll never see anything even close to a majority in the Senate. Just can't imagine. Even if you can get some kind of a deal in the House at 50%.
Yeah. And so that means that because of the different factions who now, because of what's developing, they're not automatically, which has been a problem anyway, I'll just vote along party line. And if my superiors, allow some of us to cross over, because actually it's a decent idea, we will. But now it's not following what the party leaders say. It's what my faction says. So like, for example, let's say more and more socialists become elected. Well, they'll have a leader of the socialism, which right now would be Bernie Sanders, and they'll look to him of, well, what should we do on this vote? And it won't be about what do the Democrats say. It's what should we do? No, we don't like it. And they won't like it for their own purposes. So they'll be fighting their own party. And therefore, nothing will ever get passed, and it'll become basically stagnant, and anything that's good will not be moved because of the factions. And if things start to go south meaning economically or something else that requires a different voting, they're not going to get it done. And the president can't do anything about it. He'll try to make executive orders, but there's just certain things he can't do. Now, in our country, because of how it was set up by the founding fathers, we're different than a lot of other countries who already started with a knowledge that you're going to have all these different factions. Israel is one example. They typically, by the way, they have generally 11 to 12 parties. Then there's a bigger one, and then there's the next bigger one. And the ones that are, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, they're 2%, 2 or 3%, but they're there and they have a faction. Well, in our elections, if you get a majority, so let's say you had 6 factions and you got 30% and everyone else got 18%, you would win. And of course, you'll be set up, but you're going to have all these different factions that win their little pieces. And we don't ever come to an agreement because we can fight each other because of how we're elected. In Israel, they already know that. We're not going to get a majority to start with. So what they do is, okay, whoever got the biggest vote, you have a month to cobble together a coalition of all these different factions, and you go to them and negotiate. Would you support these policies that I have? I'll let you have a few of your policies in, and we'll put this amalgam together, and let's all vote for each other when we get to the Knesset, which would be equivalent to our Senate. And they do. By the way, if they don't get the majority, and they have to have enough signed up, it says, yep, we're gonna vote this way. They go to the next party and say, okay, you got a month to do it, and you put it together. If you can put it together, okay. If they can't, they say, okay, nobody could do it. We're starting over. We're going to have another election and just do the whole thing all over again. Now, this is interesting because, in a sense, because of what happened, this kept Netanyahu in power for years because he couldn't do it, but the other party couldn't do it. And what happens is it just goes back to what's status quo in terms of how you're already put together. Doesn't mean he'll get the biggest vote. It's the same thing in different countries around the world, is that they've already figured this out. But for us, because of our system, we actually can't handle many factions, because what it does, it puts us to a place where nothing will happen. And that's where it's headed right now, because these factions are gaining strength. They don't really care anymore about the party. And I have my own faction. And I think what will happen is it will stagnate on getting things done, which I believe will give credence, particularly to the younger generation, that our system doesn't work. So we should replace it with a one world government and let them run the show. Any other observations or thoughts about that?
So right after an election, there's generally a vote in the Senate and the House to establish new leaders, especially if the parties in control have changed. And so there's a lot of positions that are part of that. We know the Speaker of the House, the Minority Leader, the Majority Leader, and in the Senate. But when you've also got this problem of these factions and the ability or inability to find leaders. And I think it was either in the last election or 2 elections ago. It took a long time, to remember, they kept voting over and over and over and over, and they can't conduct any other business in one of those 2 houses, maybe it's the Senate, without having these positions filled. So we may see, and I think when I looked at what's the longest period that the House has ever gone without a majority leader and a minority leader, it was 60 days. And I think it was Kevin McCarthy was finally the one who was finally voted in. That means no other business is done during that. So this problem isn't just about passing laws. It could potentially interfere with the ability to even convene one or both of the houses of Congress.
Yeah. And so I think the thing to watch would be, particularly as we head to this midterm, do the factions get stronger and proliferate? And therefore we can predict that the division is going to go deeper and the inadequacy of getting things done is going to increase. And it's playing right into the hands of developing a one world government. So I think we're seeing it right before our eyes, and the impact of basically division.
And the current leaders, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, who probably is calling the shots on this new movement in the Democrat Party, but he has no official leadership role there. It's just been imputed to him. But you look at the leaders, the 4 key leaders, and a lot of the committee chair people, they are not regarded as the leaders of the direction that either of the parties is going. They're more the protectors of the status quo and the tradition and governance structure. And especially with this younger generation, if they show up to vote, they don't care about any of that. And so who are going to emerge as the leaders in Congress in this next vote, in this next Congress? And what's going to happen to the current leaders? Are they all going to basically be displaced? Because they don't seem to be enjoying much success with the public.
Yeah, and it was interesting, because what we went through recently is called the primaries. And the primaries are, you as a party elect your representative to then go to the November election, and you're going to oppose the opposite party. Well, what you just said is something that I observed, and it did surprise me, but a big number of what they call incumbents have been there for years. Normally, if you've been there for years, you just stay there. They don't overthrow you, because you have so much power and authority in your area or your position that I think they assumed, well, I'll be able to stay, and so I don't need to worry about this, this guy coming after me. Well, they got tossed out, and when you're tossed out as a primary, you can't run, so they're not going to be there. It'll be somebody brand new, no matter what, and so there's a shifting of all this, and I think again the shifting is more toward socialistic viewpoint, let government run things. There's a movement toward one world government, globalism. We got to control the economy better and spread the wealth better. And there's a whole new mentality developing. And I think out of those factions will come a potential, I think, predict a big problem economically, which is, I think, going to drive it. And then out of that economic collapse will be a new idea, and when the new idea isn't really new, it's going to be one world government, but everybody will embrace it because they'll say, well, that will work since ours doesn't, and let's go join that, so that's going to be an interesting, dynamic. Now we know, by the way, and if you look at it in its purest sense, if you had a honorable, respectful, benevolent one world government, interesting enough, it would actually be the best form of government, because we can have unity again and make better decisions because the heart is toward the benefit of all. And wouldn't that be a good idea? So again, in its purest form, it would be a good idea. But we know because of what happens is that it's actually being controlled by Satan, which is kill, steal, and destroy. So when it's set up, it'll appear benevolent. We're going to do this for the benefit of the world and you're going to benefit from it. And everyone's going to say, yep, we agree, we support it, we embrace it, we give up our sovereignty, we do it. And over literally 3.5 years, because remember, we're talking about the tribulation. And it starts with one world government and ends with, Christ's return after God's wrath, is because of the source of it. It's not benevolent. It's deceptive. And deceptive is actually to control things and because of the spiritual dynamic, it's not for the benefit of the people, it's for the benefit of itself to have control and run things against God. And so it's not healthy. It's not benevolent. It'll look that way, but it's very, very deceptive. And ultimately, there'll be a control to it. So I think we're seeing the formation of things that are put in place to see that come about. And this division and factions is interesting.
It would have been inconceivable just a few years ago if we lay out all the things that we now see on the horizon with, the kinds of candidates and the kinds of issues that are being put forward and supported. And we would have said, well, that's not even possible. And it's happened so quickly that this idea that this could move even more quickly down a path, you can see how the pieces are all falling in place. And we're watching it happen and we're kind of marveling at it and and also shocked by it. Because how could this be happening? How could this be happening? How could somebody be so ignorant or unaware to support this or to support that? There's so much of that going on. But as you said, we're perhaps seeing what are the elements of the end, and we're seeing right before us how they fall together. It's just not. It's until you see it, you can't imagine that it could happen.
Yeah, that's right. And as we think about that, it has a big part of the economy, and we're at this very interesting intersection where what's going to happen economically. And I know you've done a little bit of research into just current economic conditions. So why don't you just talk briefly about that, and then we can talk about, where does this go because of this interesting place where there's certain things that appear really well, but there's other things that are underneath it.
So we're actually in a very prosperous time in the United States for our economy. And you can come to that conclusion if you look at the pillars of what makes a free market economy work. Employment is very strong. Companies are successful in almost every industry, and they're growing, which means people are buying their products and services, and other companies are buying products and services at record levels. We have growth in almost every industry. Factories are being built all over the United States. Investment dollars are flowing from all over the world to invest in the United States. And companies are doing well. They're producing products, and their profits are strong. And the reason we know that is because we follow these indexes, these stock market indexes, both small companies, mid-sized companies, large companies, tech companies, traditional companies, and they're all doing well at record levels. And so those who understand how the economy works and follows these facts would say that makes investors motivated. It makes them positive. It makes them want to invest money in more of their money, if they've got money or they're in retirement funds, into U.S. enterprises. And so money continues to flow into U.S. companies, and they continue to grow and prosper as a result. On the other side, people who are not studied in that and are not active investors would say, well, that's this thing over here, the stock market. But what I'm concerned with is my own household economy. My household economy is struggling. Everything seems very expensive and getting more expensive. And my wages, I'm not making enough more money every year to cover how much more it costs to live. And that's that at the same time that it's truth in what I talked about, the fundamentals of our economy. It's also true that people are struggling more. A dollar seems to buy less today than it did a year ago. And both of those things are driving the political decision making. We have a very strong economy. We're a strong country, probably the strongest in the world right now. We're growing. Meanwhile, everything costs a lot of money, and people's wages, even though there's plenty of jobs, people are having to either work 2 jobs or they're having to work differently, or they're having to downsize their lives a bit to be able to afford to get by. And that drives a huge amount of the motivation to vote and how you vote.
Yeah. And when you look at the economy and economic scenario, is that, they have, let's say we have three classes. We have probably more, but let's say three. We have lower class, middle class, upper class. Upper class, we would call them, rich. They're rich people. So the middle class and the lower class, which represent, 85% of the population, the things that they have to buy are all really rising in prices because it's necessities. It's housing costs are going crazy, and now we have a high mortgage rates, and along came rental rates that actually increased just as much. So you can't just find a low cost housing. You don't have many options. Cars. I mean, I was just reading an article about a new automobile, which, I like automobiles, and the price tag is $110,000. And I'm thinking that's crazy. When I came out of school, and of course this is in the 70s, a house cost $23,000. And, kids coming out of school, I made okay money, and they make a lot more than I did, but relatively speaking, they're kind of making the same level that I made, and for them to be able to afford an expensive car or a house or an apartment, and they got to buy food, and they have to buy fuel, and they have to buy insurance, and they have to buy clothes and just things to exist. And behind that, there was an article that showed that 72% of all Americans right now live paycheck to paycheck. And a lot of them aren't making even that. So what they do is they use credit cards, which adds interest that even sucks it more. And the only thing they know is that, and almost like, who cares? When I get to a point where I can't pay it anymore and I tell the credit card company I can't pay it, they just get somebody to release the debt and start over. So they almost don't look at it as like, I'm getting in a hole I can't get out of. It's like, I'm getting in a hole, I can't enjoy it, but I'll still survive. But there's this interesting dilemma of, the market and people who can afford to be in the market, and the upper middle to middle upper class, they have what's called disposable income still, but that below that, they don't have much, and it's pushing on it. So if they see like, I can't get there anymore, and the government says, I'll take care of you, my thought is, well, why not? I wouldn't think normally I would vote that way, and it doesn't seem right to me, but I can't make it anyway. And if they promise to take care of me, you know what? Maybe it's not such a bad idea. And I believe that's one of the examples in New York. That's what happened. Is he gave a lot of promises, and they said, I can't afford to live here, so why not? I might as well. And if that gains traction, there'll be a big divide. And ultimately, what's going to happen, to the economy, is there going to be a trigger that, pulls it down, that causes now the next level of people to suffer, where everybody says, hey, we need a new solution, which could be the one world government. And I would just, let's end with this, Denny, is what do you think we should watch economically to see which direction this goes to in the next, let's say 6 to 12 months?
Well, I think the inflation rate is super important, and we forget that inflation is a compounding issue. So when we had 9% inflation 6 years ago, and then that inflation rate slowly came down after the previous administration transition, it came down from 9%, 8.7654, came down to 3.5% now. We didn't eliminate that 9% inflation rate.
Yeah.
It's in the base of everything. And so inflation is a compounding effect. So the only way to get our costs down where they were 10 years ago is to have deflation. And a lot of it. And so watching this inflation rate is important because it compounds. And what we would need to be thinking about is inflation rates at 0 or less for a while on certain goods. Housing, we would expect, if it's going to be affordable and it's going to be on the cost side, we would have to see negative housing inflation for quite a while. And that may be one of the ways to get there. Otherwise, we have to see wage inflation, substantial wage inflation. And there's nothing that suggests that's coming with all this AI work, other than if the economy grows so much and we all become so productive that perhaps there's enough economic power in all that for wages to start growing faster than costs.
Right. That's right.
Those are the two things I'd be watching.
Yep. And the one thing you said, which is interesting, you live in California, and I know the incredible price, of housing there. We would think, well, certainly isn't there going to be a gigantic correction? And in California, there never has been. It's shocking,
It is shocking.
And because of I think it's because of the structure. And one thing you said, we got to keep appreciating when you said, 987, whatever. So here we are 6 years later, the costs have gone up 30%. Now it's at 3% right now, but it's not 3% over 6 years ago. It's 3% over last year. And last year was 27% higher. And our income hasn't grown that much. So we're getting squeezed. And so the question's going to have to watch is inflation, interest rates, particularly for housing, and then unemployment. And is there going to be a correction of any kind? And ultimately, and we saw this in 2008, 2000, I guess it was in 21, that the market did correct. And there was a big whack, to everybody. Of course, it came back. But, and is part of the truth that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And there isn't an easy way to bridge that gap. And that separates the divide. And so when you think of something simple like the French Revolution, that's what caused it, is that, there's so few people who are gaining and so many people who aren't. That's it. We've had it, and we're going to overthrow it. And we may be overthrown by socialist voting to say, let's go that way. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. So, Father, we thank you that you tell us to have wisdom, to have understanding, to keep pursuing what you have to show us, what things we are to watch, what's the implication of that, and then what does that mean to us in terms of our walk with you, in terms of enjoying life still, not to be fearful, to be aware and to be watching, but to have people around us that we can together understand the dynamic of what's ahead. And we pray for that and we look for that in Christ's name. Amen. Well, thanks, Denny. It's good to see you, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.